Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second roundtable organized by the Center of Voice Studies at Aarhus University. And this time we are here together to discuss voices, technology, and mediatization. And we have a couple of invited panel speakers today, and we've got one here in the physical space. This is a hybrid roundtable. We have Claire French, who's an assistant professor in dramaturgy here at Aarhus University, and who works on multilingualism and ethics and societal issues and voices in all kinds of ways. Then online, I'll just move from who I can see from the left to the right. I first see Dom, and actually, is it Dom what? Is that the pronunciation?
Yes. Sorry, I haven't got my name displayed there. I should change that.
And, no, sorry, I should have said Dominic Watt. Dominic Watt is professor at the University of York, working in linguistics, but also specializing within forensic linguistics. And so, of course, their voices and technology enter quite a great deal. And then finally, we have Catherine Sangster, who is the executive editor of Oxford Pronunciations, working with also the Oxford English Dictionary and Oxford University Press. And Catherine also used to work with BBC, and I forget the name of the pronunciation unit at the BBC. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just make sure you can hear me okay?
We can.
You can, great.
Perfect. So I'm going to start by a little introduction also for people who will find this on YouTube. So I think everybody has come here together today because we all know that technology is so crucial in communication, especially now with AI, but not only with AI. And so there are all kinds of interesting questions for us to consider when we think about the representation of voices and the consumption of voices in technology, media, various related platforms. And so just to get into the theme, I'll start with some more general questions. And so this is a question for really any of the panelists and also people sitting here. But which areas of how we use technology do you see as the most relevant with respect to how we think about voices? Or maybe the most dangerous? And I'm actually going to ask Catherine if you would like to start, because I formulated this question based on your questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really broad question, but the areas that I am particularly interested in or particularly experienced in are around the voices that are used in media context, the voices that are used to encode some sort of authority or correctness, or so that might be the voice of a dictionary. You know, that when we choose to have a dictionary that speaks its pronunciations aloud, how we might generate those pronunciations, and what that might, the choices that we make as dictionary makers to do that, but also the expectations that users might have around that. So I think those are decisions that that bear a certain amount of examination and consideration and change quite a lot. Mm-hmm. I think there's also a whole area around sort of voices in broadcast media and different voices from, you know, in different areas and different perspectives. So I know there are lots of other potential areas, but those would probably be the two that I could speak the most to. Yeah.
And I think Dom's area also adds additional dimensions.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, everybody carries a recording device around in their pocket these days. That much is very well established. But as I'm sure we're all aware, samples of our voices can be obtained with our consent, without our consent, knowingly, unknowingly. there are lots and lots of ways that the voice can be captured by bad actors, shall we say. And in my line of work, this is very much a factor that we're confronting these days. AI technology is now capable of producing extremely lifelike voice clones, deepfakes, and this is something that forensic speech analysts have to deal with every day, actually. And the results of this kind of synthesis are getting better all the time. So it's a bit of an arms race going on at the moment. I'm happy to talk about that a bit more later.
So we will be covering mainly two areas. One will be the forensic area, and then the other one will be one linked to attitudes and prescriptivism. And we'll start with the dictionaries, and then we'll also move to Claire's area, which is in dramaturgy and mediatized speech.
I might just add something to what Catherine was saying, because theatre and performance have worked similarly to the media in how they've served like nationalizing functions of reproducing language ideologies around the standard language. So most conservatoires that teach actors will train them in a standard language. In Australia, where I'm from, everyone wants to sound like Kate Blanchett. And obviously we could go into what Kate Blanchett's variety is beyond that. And that is all, it's not all shifting, but there's a kind of a critical turn in how varieties are taught. And this is also very much associated with what type of theatre is being produced and supported. So we're moving away from like mimicry and characterizations as kind of putting on a mask, which is always a bit of a simplification and in performance training, but I'll use it for now, to then searching further into what the actor holds in terms of their linguistic and embodied resources. And that search has also collided with identity studies and decoloniality and et cetera, et cetera. So we're at a really interesting time where we're searching further for kind of understanding what resources the performer brings with them to training and devising and create kind of collaborative creation settings where you create a play together or a screenplay, etc. And we're then also having the rise of synthetic voices coming into that. So I think there already are a lot of very kind of varying approaches to how those synthetic voices are picked up as further variation or as standardizing properties. So yeah, just a little intro.
And the standardization note is absolutely fantastic, because that leads us directly to the next theme. And so I thought it might be nice to start with going back in times a little bit. And this is where Catherine's questions come in. And as I've said, Catherine works with the OED and has worked with the OED and BBC as well. And so I wondered if Catherine could share what you think about whether there is such a thing as a dictionary voice, and how has this been changing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about what the Oxford English Dictionary and what Oxford University Press does, because other dictionaries make other choices. But so we, when I started working at OUP, the Oxford English Dictionary, the big flagship dictionary, did not have recorded voices pronouncing its entries. Other dictionaries that OUP published did have, smaller dictionaries and trade dictionaries did have audio delivered online, but OED didn't, and that was one of the main projects I joined to make happen. And we had an established way of creating the audio for our dictionaries, which now feels sort of charmingly retro, in that we have real people who go into sound booths and read the words aloud, and we record them, and we post-produce them in order to make sure the levels are comparable, and that we clean up any little pops, and we do all the usual sound engineer stuff to make them nice clean recordings. And as I say, they're in a sound booth, so they're quite different from live voice recordings which are perhaps crowdsourced or recorded on mobile data in open spaces. So they're somewhat curated live voice, if you like, but and we choose our speakers based on, we want them to be, scare quotes, authentic speakers of the variety in question, so that nobody is performing a variety of English. That's another thing I should probably say, is that the OED, for those who aren't familiar with it, as well as giving pronunciations for every entry that isn't obsolete in British English, by which we mean standard Southern British English, and American English, a sort of general American, pronunciations for entries which belong to particular parts of global English-speaking world outside of those two territories, also have pronunciations, transcriptions, and audio for New Zealand English, Australian English, South African English, Malaysian English, 20 other varieties of English. And again, those are spoken for us live in a recording studio by people who are speakers of that variety of World English. So it's quite a time-consuming, it's quite a significant chunk of our work producing this audio, but it's what we feel is kind of the best value and the most kind of, well, the most special way we can make our product be, by having these recordings, rather than by having a synthesized recording generated from either IPA or perhaps directly from orthography, with all of the complicating factors that English orthography would introduce to that. So yeah, that's how we make our audio, and it's delivered via our website, oed.com, which you should be able to access via institutional logins or subscription, however you get to your dictionaries. The one other thing I wanted to mention is that we've recently added a function which I'm really pleased about, and I think it's very relevant to the idea of sort of voice and authority in a dictionary setting, and that is, we can now attach more than one recording to any given transcription. So typically, if you look at a dictionary entry, you'll have the transcription or transcriptions if it's the variant forms, and then you'll have a little play button and it will play somebody saying it that you can hear. But now we have the ability to have a drop-down menu, and you can potentially hear more than one person giving a pronunciation which is aligned with the broad transcription you see, but it's not the same speaker. And so that variation, that sort of the more kind of nuanced variation and differences that wouldn't necessarily be reflected by a different IPA symbol will still be produced, and so you can hear more variety. And I think that's, well, I'm really pleased. It took us a while to get that functionality in place, and yeah, I'm really happy that we have that, because it means that we're not saying here is this one monolithic voice that is the one true way of saying something. It gives us a lot of scope to reflect greater diversity in the voices that we have, which is really important.
And could we talk about the motivation behind this choice a bit more? Because I know this is something that's relatively recent with the digital OED, this addition of global Englishes. Could you tell us more about how the management of the dictionary decided? Did it come from the users of the dictionary or from the team? And how has this been received by those who use the dictionary, and by those who are supposed to be represented by these recordings as well?
So the wider decisions about inclusion for global Englishes or world Englishes is made by other lexicographers, particularly my colleague Danica Salazar, who is our executive editor for the World Englishes. So the inclusion of words, I mean, the inclusion of words in the dictionary in general is a matter of quantitative data analysis and looking at how much things are used, and making sure that where we're looking is as broad as possible scope of where you can find language use. So we wouldn't choose like, oh, it's time we had it's time we had Sri Lankan English, for instance. There's one that was added in the last couple of years. We are guided by the inclusion of Sri Lankan English words in the dictionary, and then we add the pronunciations. And the way that we operate is that we would look at existing phonological and phonetic studies of that variety of English, develop a transcription model based on the scholarship that is out there, transcribe accordingly, and then have our speakers come in. And there's often quite a valuable feedback loop where we'll build a model and we'll consult people if it's not a phonology that any of our team is particularly up on. Then we'll bring in phonetic phonological consultants, and then we'll get a speaker who, as I say, is a person who actually speaks that variety of English. And sometimes that will be a helpful additional part of the process to say, oh, well, they say this is very limited to one area of this variety of English, and so we can loop back and make sure that we're producing something real. We're producing something that's evidence-based and reliable and contemporary and true. So as far as the motivation for doing it that way, as we follow wider editorial decisions, but we're very much keen to look at, well, you can probably imagine all the different areas where it can become complicated, where, for instance, you don't have a single variety that's codified as a national standard, or where there's variation along particular lines. We have to make sure that we aren't being selective. In some ways, that's less of an issue than with a very close phonetic transcription, as you might have in a forensic context or in a clinical context. In a lexicography context, transcriptions are quite broad, and so you have a little bit more wiggle room, perhaps.
Could you also tell us more about what kind of attitudes you've encountered as you've been implementing these changes towards more inclusive voice representation? Were there some users who contacted you to say they don't like it, or the opposite, that they really appreciated it?
I mean, in general, I'm happy to say it's very positively received. We had absolutely rapturous response recently in the press, anyway, in the Maltese press, when Maltese English was added, I don't think I haven't been aware of anything other than a positive response. It can be more. There are areas where the concept of a world English that is not that is different from the standard as it might be expressed on a British, where that is seen as problematic in some particular, in educational institutions, for instance. I would say that perhaps came up particularly around our model for Indian English. That there were still some areas where standardization used SSBE, received pronunciation, if you like, as a standard, which is a whole separate conversation. But that's not really that wouldn't really be a concern about what we were doing with Indian English. But yeah, that's probably the only less than rapturous response that I can think of. But no, in general, the widening coverage and the way that we have expressed, and people usually just very pleasantly surprised to discover it, and because there's a lot of ideas and preconceptions about what the voice of a dictionary might be, and it's nice to be able to undermine that and to challenge that, to build on that and do something different.
That also leads beautifully to one of our topics, which is, because so far we've been discussing what could be thought of as the dictionary voice, but is this kind of dictionary voice limited just to dictionaries, or do we actually encounter this elsewhere? Because historically, I think the dictionary voice is in a way the voice of standardization and standard language ideology as well, and that's now being challenged in at least some dictionaries. And so because of this thing with standard language ideology, I was wondering, would the three of you who are here, who were invited think about this? Do we have to deal with similar issues, not just in dictionaries, but also in other technological products or mediatized products?
This is a huge question. I'll give an example. Recently, so most of my key questions come out of performance practice, and the proposal at the moment that I'm writing, a grant proposal, has come out of one example at Nordisk Laboratorium in Holstebro in the northeast here in Denmark, where we were exploring, it was ChatGPT 4 as an interlocutor in Esperanto. And there were long-held pauses between the actor and ChatGPT, and then there were many corrections made from ChatGPT to the interlocutor, saying, I think you might have meant this in Esperanto, and oh no, I don't understand what you mean there. I think that what you're saying doesn't generally make sense. Maybe we could try it in this. So there was this kind of constant wearing down of this actor who came in at the beginning of the process saying, I really want Esperanto to be part of this character who had been brought back from the dead because it was about cryonic preservation of someone's brain being attached to a young body. And they were circus artists. And it was quite a fun idea that Esperanto as this kind of language which is attached to language ideologies of hope and universality, particularly, some time ago, for this head that was frozen in the 70s, for this person to only speak Esperanto. And after this moment with ChatGPT, the actor didn't explore Esperanto again in the rehearsal room. And it was a 3-month process of rehearsals, right? So we had a lot of time. And it really kind of was a motivator for me to be starting to think about how we can, one, use chatbots, AI chatbots as multilingual interlocutor when you don't necessarily have those languages or varieties represented by other people in the rehearsal room, which is super useful for minoritized languages and varieties. But then how we really need to test and train that AI with sociolinguistic, sociophonetic knowledge, and kind of work with kind of different levels of open-endedness in AI that AI currently can't quite do, and also kind of change the listening abilities of the AI chatbots, which I think very much fits with the knowledge of people in this room. So it's an example. I know it's very random, but this is an example of kind of standardization, how it exists in relation to AI. Yeah.
Would Dom and Catherine like to add anything before moving on?
Yes, well, a couple of things spring to mind there. One is to do with the attitudes that lay people and the members of the legal community have towards variety, variation in English. And of course, as I've said in a few places in print before, the materials that we use in my line of work in forensic speech and audio analysis is really language in the wild. That's the way I put it before. It's not mediated in the same way as sociolinguistic data has to be, because of considerations of getting permission from ethics committees and things like that. When we receive recordings it's mainly from the police, intelligence agencies and so on, government departments. This is completely unfiltered language. It's language that's being used by real people in real life situations. There tends to be some kind of, an element of forensic interest. It's mainly criminal investigations, criminal cases, trials. But it's there. That's what language really is like, because sometimes people don't even know they're being recorded. So I think it's absolutely vital that we as analysts be alive to, what kinds of variation are really genuinely out there. Very often the literature hasn't had a chance to catch up So you don't know if such and such a pronunciation is typical or distinctive. Of course, those are the things that we're looking for in our analyses. What makes a speaker unique or different from other members of the community that they come from? Can we determine what community they might come from? People, after all, sometimes have hybrid accents, hybrid dialects, and it can be very difficult to place them geographically. Then you have bilingualism and all these different factors that intrude on what we're trying to do. But we're trying to see speakers as individuals. That's the thing, not as representatives of groups necessarily, of dialect or accent groups. We're trying to say, what is it that makes that person a member of group X, but also different from the typical member of that group? So it's from the socio-phonetic point of view, the sociolinguistic point of view, it's a very intensive kind of interrogation that we do of the materials that we have. Now, just to go back to what lay people might think, of course, in the UK and other common law jurisdictions like the United States, Australia, and so on, we have trials by jury, and members of juries are not highly educated in many cases. They may not be native speakers of English. I mean, really, the qualifications to become a juror in the UK anyway are you over 18 years of age, and do you have a criminal record or not? And otherwise, they just take anybody, I mean, literally, well, not literally off the street, but literally off the electoral roll. Okay, so anybody is potentially there to be called to do jury service and to help decide on the guilt or innocence of an accused person. You might say, well, that's a crazy system, but it's the one that we have and it's used all over the world. It certainly has its faults, its shortcomings. Now, so what that means is, for, say, myself as an expert witness, somebody trying to explain the kinds of analyses we've done on speech recordings. Typically, I should say, by the way, I suppose the lion's share of the casework we do is speaker comparison, where we have a recording of somebody who's up to no good, doing a drug deal or trying to defraud a bank or something like that, and then a reference recording of a known person, a suspect, in police interview more often than not. And we have to compare those two things. And so when we try to explain what it is we've done to establish a level of similarity or difference between those voice samples, when we have to explain those to the members of the court and to the jury, these lay people, these untrained people, uneducated people sometimes, it's really difficult. You know, you're trying to explain how phonetic transcription works. I mean, that's difficult enough. But then things like acoustic analysis, it's really, really tough. And everything, of course, is mediated through standard language ideology. It's inescapable that the people that you're talking to won't have normative ideas about not just how words are pronounced, but how they should be pronounced. Just to give you a concrete example, I was giving evidence at a murder trial in London last year, and I made some remark about the young men in this recording. It was a doorbell camera recording. These two men were running past the camera after having been involved in a stabbing that had resulted in the death of another young man. And I was told by the defense lawyer who was cross-examining me, how much do you know about the kind of language that these young men would use? I said, well, you know, I'm not completely unfamiliar with it. My stock in trade is English accents and dialects. So it's not one I've done research on very much. I have done some, but they decided to use this as a line of attack. They said, you don't know anything about the patois, they called it, that these young men of Afro-Caribbean extraction were using, do you? You're not a native speaker of that. I said, they're not speaking patois, they're speaking English, and moreover, it's a non-standard variety, but it's grammatically no different from the kind of English that I'm speaking now. And somehow that got turned into correct versus incorrect English, and that was the kind of automatic equivalence that they drew. And it was then difficult for me to try to explain, I didn't use those words, those are your words. I never said correctness, incorrectness. But I think already by that point, the seed might have been planted in the minds, perhaps, of the jurors, that these young men can't use English properly, they speak incorrect English. And it's known from research that's been done on this subject that there is an association between non-standard English usage and criminality. You know, for better or worse, that is the way that people tend to think about it. And so there's a big risk, I think, that we don't make it clear right from the outset that we need to dissociate ideas like that very quickly. Non-standardness is not incorrectness, because that can just trigger a whole series of associations and prejudices on the part of listeners. And the other thing I would like to say, really, just while we're on these general themes, is that we found, so as I mentioned before, we have to take into account the possibility, the ever-increasing possibility, that speech samples we're given to analyze are actually not authentic. So authentication used to be quite a rare task for us to do, but now it's routine, because we have to establish, as before we do anything else really, whether the samples that we're using are absolutely 100% authentic human speech, or have been wholly or partially created by artificial intelligence. And we know from having done a bit of research on this that if you base your deepfake voice on real speech, so there's two ways of doing this. You can either use text-to-speech synthesis, you type in text and a voice is created out of thin air, well, on the basis of training material that it's derived a model from. Or you can start with a real recording and have a kind of a veneer, an overlay of a particular voice laid on top of it. And what we've noticed is that the models that the second type of synthesis use very often apply a little bit of normalization vis-a-vis accents because of the material they've been trained on. And so what you find is there are features in the suspicious material which are more standard-like than you would expect to find on balance. And so that can actually be used as a little bit of a clue as to whether you're dealing with authentic material or not. As I mentioned before, there's a real arms race going on at the moment. It's very difficult to try and keep abreast, try and keep up with the way that the technology is not just being adapted and developed by human agents, but it's in a sense making changes to itself day on day. So trying to keep up with that kind of development is a real challenge for us and for the field more generally.
So now you opened up a beautiful path to various other questions that you and Olli Niebuhr were interested in. I should also say Oliver Niebuhr contributed with a lot of the questions we are going to discuss, but sadly he couldn't be here. So Olli is also represented in this panel discussion. And so one of Olli's questions was whether AI and communication technologies are driving us towards a smaller set of vocal styles. And I think that's actually quite linked to what Dom was talking about just now, because I really like that you emphasize this idea that speakers are monoliths who don't have hybrid identities. Because then once I start looking for these authentic speakers, very often half of the people who approach me have lived too long in one area and then too long in a different area. And so then you wonder, why are we excluding these people? And when we do get people with hybrid identities in practice, such as in your forensic work, how do we link it with a lot of the research which is almost clinical in this respect, maybe a bit shockingly. So I think that's also part of what Olli meant with whether AI is driving us towards a smaller set of vocal styles, because you also just mentioned that these clones are based on specific types of voices. So could the fact that these voices are less likely to reflect hybrid identities, could that actually be used to figure out in your line of work whether that's a fake or not?
Potentially, yes. It's a bit difficult to say, really. We don't know. The problem is we don't really know where the training material is coming from. As we all know, AI systems will just harvest material from here, there, and everywhere. They don't ask permission. It's very difficult to say day on day, actually, where these models are coming from and what their characteristics are. We make use of deepfake detection tools. We have an arrangement with a company in California which specializes in this area. And it's no exaggeration to say that if we run the same tests on the same material on consecutive days, the results can be different. And we don't really know why. And if we ask the software vendors, what's your view on this? They'll say, well, overnight, the huge body, the corpus of training material may have changed. There may have been updates within the software. In a sense, it doesn't seem like it's completely under their control. Trying to then package this for the courts and say, well, we're not really sure what the software is doing. We've talked to the manufacturers. They're not always very sure what it's doing either. It doesn't play well with the courts. They like certainties, or as near as can be achieved certainties. But that is one factor, as I mentioned, that may help. I'll give you again a concrete example. One of my colleagues has done quite a lot of work on the speech of Serbian English bilinguals, and she has tried out various ways of deep faking speech, individual speakers or models which are based on multiple speakers, just to see what sorts of results fall out. And she was really interested to see that in some cases there was a kind of normative process going on of the sort that I mentioned before, where some of the pronunciations which would be characteristic of Serbians from a particular region of Serbia were actually being converted into something that sounded more like spoken Croatian with respect to the pronunciation of fricatives. And you can make of that what you will. It's hard to generalize to another situation. But I think it's quite telling that sort of normative process is at least potentially built in to deepfake technology. When it comes to speech recognition, we've probably all heard about these systems which perform much better with standard accents than non-standard ones. There's been work done on, for example, African American English, looking at how inconsistent or imprecise speech recognition can be if people speak in a non-standard variety. So it's working in both directions. There are efforts, sometimes rather half-hearted efforts, to try and address these problems. The big tech companies are not very interested really in that side of things. They prefer to just leave it to the workings of the technology to figure those things out on their own. But at least it's a known effect. It's something that we can factor in our work to a limited extent, anyway.
Could you tell us more about the protections under intellectual property law or some other relevant legislation which are currently in place to do something about this?
This is very much a case of running to catch up. The existing legislative frameworks in many countries are just completely ill-equipped to try and handle the miscarriages of justice or the potential misuse of speech technology. I've done a study with some colleagues in York, which, if you're interested, you can read about in the International Journal of Speech, Language and the Law from just a few years ago. I worked with an intellectual property lawyer, specializes in copyright issues and things of that nature. With the overarching research question, who owns your voice? And it might seem very self-evident. Well, isn't that me? And the answer is not at all straightforward. As I mentioned at the beginning, samples of your voice are collected all the time, often without your knowing about it, let alone giving your consent to it. And who knows thereafter what happens to them. We know that they're collected by institutions such as banks and insurance companies and so on. But there's a risk anyway, a potential risk that they might be, through the work of hackers, they might be obtained illicitly and then used to build fake speech models. What recourse do you have? What redress do you have? Well, at the moment, it's very, very difficult to say. Lawyers don't really have a great deal of idea about how to approach these sorts of problems. We're behind the curve, I would say, in terms of where we should be. So I'm not doing research of that type anymore as such, but my collaborator, Peter Harrison at the law school at the University of York, he's continuing in this vein and doing more extended studies. So I would, if you're interested in this, I would recommend having a look at Peter Harrison's website. Anything else I would add to that? I suppose we're charting or trying to chart unknown territory at the moment. It's really difficult to say where this is all going. I think we have a sense that the constituency of bad actors out there is absolutely vast, and that as time goes on, you may not need even human intervention for these sorts of strategies to be expanded and extended worldwide. It may be that systems teach themselves how to defraud the likes of you and me. It's quite alarming, actually, quite a terrifying prospect.
We actually have two, I apologize to the two forensic phoneticians who are in the physical space, but if you felt like contributing, because we will soon come out of the forensic angle, so I just wanted you to feel invited to contribute should you so wish. You are good.
I have something, some things to comment on with that. I think, well, actually, like two main comments. One is that I think that because of this problem with voice fraud, the issue of provenance is going to be more and more relevant than ever. So if we think of like art fraud, the huge piece in deciding whether artwork is fraudulent or not is the chain of provenance, actually. So it's not actually the inherent qualities in the artwork that is the only thing that they look at. They look also at the daisy chain of provenance to establish whether it's really a Renault or really a Picasso. And I think that in working with the Swedish police, which is a big piece is provenance in making sure that, this actually did come from like the signal chat from this person at this time. And that can be actually difficult to show in the court of law if the defense attorneys, can demonstrate that provenance chains in police departments are messy. It's the same with DNA evidence. There's a lot of contamination that's happened in cases of DNA. And we don't know that when they extract the signal chat that maybe it was the interlocutor's voice that was extracted and not, how can we be sure that a really, really overworked forensics technician didn't mix them up? So that's like the first comment I wanted to make, is that provenance is bigger. And the second comment I want to make is that with technology, I think actually we can get, it's really an unlocked treasure trove for typicality. So you were talking a bit like patois. Well, in the Swedish, we have Swedish multi-ethnolect, and I would say like 95% of my casework is Swedish multi-ethnolect. And we have very few reference corpora for that. Like, what am I going to go? Am I going to go into an interview and be like, "Hey, I'm from the police. We need a reference corpus," you know? But on the media, in social media, in YouTube, there's so much, and so then the more you have for a reference corpus for non-standard varieties, then the more you reduce the risk of false positives, right? Because it's like, if your reference corpus doesn't, you know, like if we think of multicultural London English and patois, like press phrasing, like, well, if your reference corpus is just like Cockney and estuary English, then you're gonna have a higher like likelihood ratio for your two recordings having cross phrasing. So, you know, what you use as a reference corpus will really affect your likelihood ratios, and YouTube is a great place to get, you know, we have Vox Celeb, for example, for English. We don't have anything like that for Swedish, unfortunately. But I think that, because we've talked a lot about the dangers of technology, I think also like a really great thing is YouTube and these things for getting better reference corpora for you know, justice purposes, for forensic purposes. So those were my two thoughts.
Just for those who should watch this online later, this was Nate Young, Stockholm University.
I'd be happy just to respond to that second point, which is that in the UK, unfortunately, our hands are a bit tied these days because of a ruling by the Court of Appeal, which said that automatic speaker recognition technology based evidence is not admissible in the courts in England and Wales, and by extension the rest of the UK. And so, although we have this wonderful technology, we can only use it for investigative purposes. So just to fill the rest of you in, this is technology which will automatically do speaker comparison by triangulating the comparison of your two samples against a reference population, and that can be of your choice if there is a set of recordings, a corpus, which you could use for that purpose. But at the moment, we're in a bit of an impasse here because the courts have said no. It's been like that for more than a decade now. In the meantime, the rest of the world goes on using increasingly sophisticated ASR technology and getting very good results with it. We do use it to some extent, I should say, but not for doing full-blown automatic speaker comparison. Rather, it's for generating what we call speaker distance scores, which is essentially just a number that gives you some idea of the level of similarity overall. If you look at the overall speech spectrum, which would point or provide support for one of two possible hypotheses. It's the same person talking in the two recordings, or it's two different people. Sometimes if you get a value close to 0, you can't really conclude anything. But that's as much as we can do with it at the moment. So much as we would love to be able to just routinely use that technology to compare voices, we're a bit hamstrung. We can't actually do it right now. For international cases, of course, there's no such restriction. So when we take on cases from other countries, then we can make use of the ASR system as a complement to the other sorts of analysis that we do using our ears and just more conventional, traditional acoustic phonetic analysis.
Can I ask something about acoustic properties? Because that's something that's just been on my mind while we've been discussing the last few things. So we recently, there's going to be an Oxford Dictionary of African American English, which is being produced by OUP in collaboration with some other bodies. And it's, we are creating real voice audio for it, but it's being created, as you might expect, not in our studio in Oxford, but in studios that we're renting, sourcing and finding places to make the audio in various places in the US. I had a conversation with our sound engineer about what was coming out of it, and he was talking about the process of sort of smoothing and homogenization, and how accustomed we all are, even on this Zoom call that we're on right now, to having, you know, in terms of acoustics rather than phonetic detail, but you know, having the edges knocked off the distinctive aspects of our speech, perhaps losing the high frequencies and so on and so on. And I'm wondering about, and so when we're playing somebody you know, a nice clean WAV file from a recording booth, it's quite an unrealistic, although it's as real as we can get it, it's also not like the other recordings that they might listen to. So it's compared with like listening to an audiobook or anything like that. I'm wondering about the impact of that. And so something like when you have evidence from something like a Ring doorbell or from recording via a mobile, what is that a dimension as well?
I see Mette is nodding away.
Yes.
Would you like to comment on that, Mette? Sorry, I'm
It's a huge factor because it affects everything, right? When you measure things and when you hear things, so it's definitely a huge factor, which is probably worse for the automatic systems really than for the phoneticians. Would you agree, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. We know from the authenticity examinations that we run that the software, good as it is often sensitive to things which are not 100% relevant, like edit points. If we prepare a file for analysis by chopping out bits that we don't want, overlapping speech, background noises, coughing, you know, the sorts of non-speech stuff that we don't care about. The software, not so much now, but at least just a few months ago, even back in the spring, we were finding that we would run these samples through the system and it would say, there's deepfake content in here, even though we were at 100% certain, and we actually ran tests on this to confirm this hunch. All it was looking at was points where the file had been sliced and diced. So there was nothing else going on at all. Obviously, that level of sensitivity has to be dialed back because it's no help for anybody. If you want to look at whether a recording has been edited, okay, that's a different question, but that's not the same as deepfake, obviously. There could be both things at play at the same time. But we find sometimes that we're getting recordings which are somebody's getting an incoming phone call on one smartphone and they'll record it on a second one. And so the chain of continuity, you know, to go back to what Nate was saying, the provenance of the original recording can't be determined because it's all mediated through this kind of second generation copy. And if you ask, well, can you get us the original one? Police officers will quite often say no, it doesn't even exist sometimes. So you just have to go with what you've been given. And when it comes to authenticity examinations, many cases, there's really nothing you can do. You say this is an authentic second generation recording, as far as we can determine, but where the original one, the one with the incriminating material in it, came from, is anybody's guess. So lots of layers there.
Catherine, in your world of dictionary making, are AI voices discussed in any way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And I mean, of course, and as and I've been doing it for long enough that as text to speech or transcription to speech, you know, when we started making the audio in the way that we do it, there was a strong argument for it being the best way we could do it, and more recently, as the technologies that would allow you to generate something synthetic have improved, then you know, there is. I feel like we continue to defend the way that we do it, and it's you know, supported and it's seen as part of our a USP. But nevertheless, it's there are questions are always raised about how might we do this without the intensive human involvement that it currently has. One other thing that happened, and this is just anecdotal really, but I think it's quite nice to have the examples. I'm appreciating the ones that Dom is giving of like specific cases. It helps me to visualize what's happening. So we have all of our speakers who, for our World English, for instance, we recently I felt that we should give them credit for their voice, for lending us their voice on the website. But we got in touch with them because we hadn't previously asked them, and I did a little form and sort of made sure they got their consent. And in one case, one of our speakers declined because they didn't want their name to be made available a lot, because she felt that although I wasn't saying, and for our variety X, we have this, but she felt that her particular variety of English could be inferred from her name, and then the relatively small number of perhaps 50 or so single word utterances that we deliver, she felt, probably not wrongly, that it wouldn't be too much of a journey to say this person, this name, all the examples of variety X in this corpus would be enough to create a deep fake that had her name in question. Of course, it wouldn't have other identifying data, and I imagine there are probably more and easier ways to get at that than by scraping a dictionary website. But it did give us pause. It made us think, oh well, we want to give credit where it's due, but we don't want to expose our contributors to a risk that neither we nor they had anticipated at the time of creating what we make. So yeah, that's one area where it has definitely come up.
I'll just scoop through the room here to see if anybody wants to contribute. But I think it's time, because we've actually been talking for an hour. So before we take a little break, I would like to revisit the use of AI in dramaturgy and in mediated voices in that world. So one of Claire's questions was how synthetic voices might influence the stories that we consume via stage and screen.
So there are so many theatre companies that are exploring AI on stage, right? And there's one of the kind of tropes that has been brought up the most is kind of human versus cyborg, human versus AI, to show what the human can do that the AI can't, right? And it's been shown as kind of getting the most amount of laughs, because every fearful human that's sitting in the audience laughs at the potential for them to win out over AI. So that's kind of been written about quite a lot. There's one company called Improbiotics, and it's been led by a data scientist, academic in computer science. His name's Piotr Mirovsky, and he works at Google DeepMind. So he's got a really interesting kind of knowledge base in that area, but also has his own theatre company. And that company, Improbiotics, have done a lot of that type of work and kind of do this kind of interesting feed between the human transcriber from the AI and back again, and they make that visible for the audience and try to kind of explore that. That's a simplification, but check out their work if you're interested. But beyond that, so all of that makes it quite visible, right? I think at the moment, something that is less visible is how AI chatbots are influencing the way we speak as an editing tool. So as an editing tool of scripts, as an editing tool of our presentations. I was just at an international conference in Australia, and I constantly heard like this negative, positive subclause alongside one another. Kind of, it's not that. It is this, and I was just like, oh my god, if I hear this again, my brain's going to explode. But no, but that's away from theatre and performance. But I think as an editing tool, it's coming to then influence how we interpret voice in the creative team, and what types of varieties we use, how kind of neutral we hope to become in our interpretation of the text. And I think that that's something that's sneaking in, because there's such an acceptance of it as an editing tool within the creative industries. And I think, I've been to many presentations on the AI environment, so using AI chatbots and speaking tools for kind of exploring ideas, and I think that's where I'm at with it. I think that's quite exciting, particularly it's kind of linguistic tools, right? But yeah.
Are you thinking more of, because I know you are very, and we've been discussing ethics actually this whole hour, and I know it's very important for you that you also do dramaturgy in practice, so you approach it both from a theoretical and a very practical societal point of view, and I know you are very interested in societal responsible representation of multiple communities. So are you thinking, could you tell us more about how you are thinking of using AI voices to do some societal good?
So starting from that example I gave you earlier in the rehearsal room, I'm very new to AI research generally. It's just been like maybe 6 months of reading for this grant proposal. And I am developing a proposal around using artificial improvisers as multilingual companions or interlocutors in the improvisational space, because collaborative devising, so ensemble groups, are increasingly used for multilingual or multi-variety storytelling, both in theatre and also in writing rooms or writers' rooms within TV and film. And so I'm seeing the possibilities in wider variety from the AI as an interlocutor with a human. So, and very much kind of what I'm trying to devise is how speech technologies and artificial improvisation from Miroski, who I mentioned earlier, can be somehow combined so that the AI chatbot begins to accommodate the voice quality and variety and language of the interlocutor. So how we can go that far in listening, and I'm unsure if that's possible at the moment, but that's what I'm trying to understand. And then what that accommodation might do in the improvisation as well, and how far should we go in terms of like the AI trying to, I'm giving agency for a moment to the AI, but us kind of building AI with the skills or possibilities to accommodate resonance and pitch and so forth, and I'm particularly looking at minoritized voices, so I think this is why I mentioned resonance. So yeah, that's what I'm exploring at the moment.
I would actually like us to stop here before the break, but I am very happy that we are also stopping on a more positive AI voice note, because so far we've been focusing on the very relevant, not so pleasant aspects of it. So I think we should remember also that there is both the negative but also some positives.
Yeah, and the skills in the room to test and train that type of technology, right?
So I am going to pause the recording for 10 minutes and then we will reconvene. We've got some more questions left, but not as many as we have covered. So if we go, like, we won't go beyond the 2 hours, but it might also happen that we are done earlier than the 2 hours. So we'll meet again at 16 minutes past. Enjoy your break.
Thank you.
Also you guys. Okay, we are back. And now I would like to ask slightly different questions, which I think build on what we've been talking about. And we started by discussions of authenticity. And one of the questions we've got from Oliver Niebuhr is, what does vocal authenticity actually mean now in the age of AI? What is an authentic voice even? And so a lot of us, I'm sure, have some opinions on that. Would Catherine like to start?
I can, I mean, all I can do is sort of say throw a couple of thoughts in. One is, I think we've already touched on the question of sort of hybridity and people having multiple influences and strands to their vocal identity. And I think that in all sorts of settings, including lexicographical ones, there is it's very important not to regard something which is sort of single track as therefore more authentic or more typical or more, you know, more of an exemplar than something that's perhaps a bit more complicated by having different, either different inputs and hybridity, or by dynamic change, such as we see with something like accommodation. Or I was very interested by what Claire said earlier about performance, moving from the idea of a performance as a masking or a sort of something external, and bringing out these ideas of like drawing from the resources, which might be multiple, that the individual performer has. So yeah, I think sort of protecting or preserving the idea of authenticity from the idea of monolithicness, or, you know, some notion of sort of simplicity and purity because of only having a single identifiable. I think that is one thing that's quite important. I'll leave it there, let other people throw some ideas in.
I'm interested in what ideas of authenticity need to be protected, because straight away, and I'm, you know, not really in this discipline, I'm slightly in sociolinguistics, but mostly in performance studies and dramaturgy. The idea of authenticity is like in the past. So I read that and I was like, got nothing to say.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm very interested in how it should be protected, and how the discipline kind of provides guidance for that. If anyone wants to.
So, but just to get it right, in dramaturgy, no, that can't be the case, that people in dramaturgy no longer think about authenticity.
Well, I mean,
in voices,
authenticity in terms of voice, right? Like, what is...
Yes.
What is an authentic voice?
Yes, because there are also specific iconic voices associated with specific kind of a persona, and so it could be authentic in the iconic sense, but totally inauthentic on some other level. No, okay. So that must be quite different from Dom's approach to authenticity.
Well, so far I've been talking about authenticity in terms of the recorded voice, or, you know, is the recording authentic? But of course we can, you know, if we go back a few years, the question was a slightly different one, which was, is this person disguising their voice? So is it a real human voice? It's just not the authentic voice of that person. And that raises a whole series of questions about what it means to be linguistically flexible. You know, is somebody who might speak differently when ringing up their bank. You know, is that a form of voice disguise? I mean, I suppose on some level you could call it that. You could say it's inauthentic. A telephone voice is something that lots of people have. But, you know, by the same token, you say, well, that's an authentic part of their linguistic repertoire, and it's something that we should take into account, you know, if we're looking at differences between voices that we're asked to analyze. Is it possible that this person sounds like that because of the circumstances? There's no attempt to deceive or anything like that. So yes, something similar to voice disguise, but not the same as it. But then, of course, we're asked quite frequently, well, we think that we've got the same, we think we've arrested the right person, but we think that they've been disguising their voice in order to defraud somebody. It might be impersonation. In fact, it might even go that far. So not just disguising their regular mode of speech, but actually trying to impersonate somebody for nefarious purposes. So there's a whole set of questions there about authenticity, I think, which are very interesting to consider, to explore, and to take into account in our casework. And actually in trying to, I suppose, pin down what this idea of authenticity might be, it actually forces you to think about, well, okay, we'll put to one side for the moment what an authentic voice is. What is actually a voice? And if you try and define that, you're going to have a really, really difficult time. And even people who write books on voice tend to sidestep the question, what is a voice? One of the best definitions that's out there is provided in a big book on the subject of voice by Jody Kryman and Diana Sittis, which looks like it's going to try and dodge the question, what is a voice actually? And they say it's just really, really hard to define, first of all. And it obviously it's to do with the way that we produce of sound, speech sounds and so on, but it's also, you can't ignore the perceptual side as well. So if you're talking about what a voice is, you have to talk about what the listener thinks of it. There's no point, it's like the tree falling in the forest, isn't it? If you say things without anybody there to hear them, well, the job is only half done in a way. So build in how people react to it. Is authenticity something to do with the way that people have memorized your voice? And obviously that's a really important thing when it comes to the way that fraudsters might operate if they're trying to impersonate somebody. One of the key tests of that is for people who are familiar with that voice, does it pass the sniff test? And if it does, well, okay, then the person has succeeded in the subterfuge. So it's a really big question. It's not a simple question. You have to, I suppose, just lay down a few quite explicit definitions of what you mean by even things as simple as what is a voice. And on top of that, you can then develop the idea of authenticity, however you define that. And it's very, very difficult to do. So then throw into the mix the fact that now we have computers talking to us and we don't know if they're human or not. It's just a really complex, difficult space just in terms of ways in which we can test the authenticity using software systems designed for that task, or do something a bit more manual where we look for hallmarks of inauthenticity. And then, what's in the ear of the beholder. And there's a whole series of things going on there, which we don't really understand very well so far. So again, if you're interested in these general themes, it might be worth looking at the paper that I co-authored with Peter Harrison, because we just try to unpack a few of those precepts before we get started, and then talk about, well, if we think that our voice is being misused by somebody else, what can we do about that? How can we even frame the question so as to make it more legally watertight? How do we even ask the questions about voice ownership? It's a very, very tricky area.
And for those interested in the role of the listener in voices, we have a recording of one roundtable dedicated solely to the role of the listener. So check it out if you'd like more. But Dom mentioned something where I was headed, so that was fantastic, because one of Olli's questions was whether we can separate vocal persuasion from vocal manipulation. And I love that question. And I also have things to say about this. But before I do, is there anyone here physically, or Dom or Catherine, who would like to start?
Well, if I may, I'll just jump in and say something about the role of the expert witness when it comes to trying to persuade the court of the correctness of an analysis, the validity of the assertions that are made. That's something that I have to think about quite a lot. You're not just trying to persuade the legal people present in a courtroom, you're also trying to you're trying to convince the jury that you're talking from an authoritative standpoint. You're not just making wild generalizations or suppositions. What you're doing is grounded in good science. And of course, the job then of the person cross-examining you is to try to undermine that competence, that expertise, and to make you look silly in front of the jury. And so, you know, advocates in law courts are highly trained in persuasive language. It's their job to try and convince others of the correctness of their position. And so, me as an expert witness, I have to try and navigate that space and not come across as as dogmatic or arrogant or trying to belittle somebody's lack of understanding of a concept. Your job there is to help further the cause of criminal justice, and it's extremely tricky. You know, I've had a bit of training in this. There's a company in London that offers courses in, well, let's call it persuasive language. I see that Oliver has on his website one of his raft of skills is charismatics, which I'd never heard of. Never heard that word until today, but I believe that's a term that's out there, and it's transparent what it means, I suppose. But maybe somebody else in the room can speak to that topic, because it's something I know very little about.
It so happens we have a specialist on charismatic speech sitting right here.
Well, I'm not the one. It's Oliver, but I work with him, so I can say something. So charisma is it used to be a term that was considered something that you're born with. So you're either natural charismatic, or poor you cannot do anything about it. Later on, and especially what Oliver and we work in the acoustics lab is, how can we train people to sound charismatic? And it stands on three main ideas, which is self-confidence, competence, and self-confidence, competence, and oh my God, I forgot the other one. But basically the idea is that depending on what I'm doing with my voice and the different vocal parameters that will make me sound in that way, and of course we need to be very aware of what is that the content of my speech is, and the ethics that of course have to be in the speech and in the discourse. But basically when we're analyzing mainly the charismatic speech is very much the vocal parameters that will make us perceive that person as, oh my God, this guy is trustworthy. This guy knows what they're talking about. And this is very much how I am doing those combinations of the vocal parameters so that I can sound such.
But you gave a talk earlier on this topic, and in the discussion that we had following the talk, we were discussing fakeness and because there is so on the one hand there is charisma, and there could be someone where I'm actually going to go back a little bit to Olli's original question about persuasion versus manipulation. And if we look up definitions of these two and what makes them different, then it's the intention of the communicator. And so I think with respect to charisma, there can be a charismatic persuader, but there could also be a charismatic manipulator with those two distinct in terms of the intention. And so I do think that there are really two things happening. There is the charisma on its own, and that consists of multiple elements, and that's what some phoneticians work on to figure out, and not just phoneticians, also other language scholars. But then there is how fakeness may impact the charisma work someone is doing. And I'm not aware of that many studies that would target fakeness. So we are actually back to authenticity again. And I would really like to share something that we discovered in one of our studies, because I'm just so I just keep coming back to it. I did a study with Zach Boyd where we analyzed Dungeons and Dragons, and we looked at Matthew Mercer and how he impersonates characters which were differentially profiled in terms of morality. And those were there were overtly evil characters where you could immediately tell from the content of their speech, from their visual appearance, from the voice quality that you were supposed to not to trust them. They were evil. You were supposed to know it right from the start. But then there were also the covert evil characters who were the manipulators. And Zach originally concatenated all of these. So I only had the voices from that one character within an entire campaign. And so, of course, sometimes there was the content which would point out to me, "Ooh, don't trust this person." But there were stretches of speech where I really had no idea what was happening. I don't know anything about the Critical Role or not much about Dungeons and Dragons. And so as I was doing my vocal profile, audio, visual and auditory analysis, I also made notes such as, "I do not trust this person. There is something about the voice that just, I don't know what it is, but I would not trust this person." And so I couldn't quite identify what it was that I wouldn't trust these voices, because in my sort of average kind of listening, they had similar vocal profiles to the genuinely good characters. So I thought, so what is it? And then I looked at the acoustics, and one of the things that I noticed straight away was that the good characters were usually portrayed with very breathy, soft voices, and so were the manipulators, the covert evildoers. But the breathiness was a little bit different. So for the genuinely good characters, I noticed that there were these genuine fluctuations in just how breathy their voices were. But for the manipulators, they also had some gradient differences in breathiness, but every now and then it would just be cut off, and it would be sort of switched on and off in more abrupt ways. So I'm convinced that there are acoustic ways to mark manipulative uses of vocal work. But I'm fascinated by it. I think it would be very useful in our lives to be able to spot bullshitters. I can see Nate and then Mette.
Yeah, so I struggle with this a bit, probably because
Would
I'm
you mind?
American,
Would you mind
and I feel
come?
like there is. Oh,
Could you come a little bit closer?
oh yeah. I was talking to. I was saying I struggle with this a bit because as an American, like some of the like European tropes of fakeness are just like how Americans do talks. So like I was joking with Nikolai about how like the impersonation that you did reminded me of a life coach from Florida, which we intuitively sort of think peddle and bullshit. But the problem with that is that if you go to like really good academic talks in Florida, I was just at N-Wave in Miami, and you know, like some of my colleagues from the States, they do present in a way that if they had presented that way in Northern Europe, it's just like, oh my God, it's too much. So I do think that there is something there that is probably just like pan-human and maybe is not mediated by cultural norms, but then I also think that there's something there that is mediated by cultural norms. And I think to complicate things, I think there's also a class component to it that is forgotten. So I think that like even within like the UK or the US, I was mentioning the life coach in Florida, there's a lower middle class aspect there that a blue-blooded North Carolinian from a landed North Carolinian class would never listen to or never buy, but their employees down the road who are North Carolinian lower middle class, they're doing the pyramid, they're going for all of that, the pyramid schemes and the Mary Kay cosmetics and all of that. So I think it's multifactorial on what you were saying about with authenticity and the bullshitters and all of that, and what is actually considered a bullshitter voice or not, that intersects with national components, but then also social class, and then also ethnicity, which is probably a little bit more dangerous to talk about than class and nationality.
And which are constantly shifting as well, right?
Yes.
So you will have a lens for reading Americans and then
Right.
for reading Swedes, obviously, right?
And then doing that, I think, in theater is probably really interesting, because if I think about The Big Short and how they had I don't know if you ever saw that movie, but the two Florida real estate agents, they do this this performance that is so wonderful and is that sort of what we talk about non-authentic manipulation. So,
Oh, you don't have to go away.
oh.
Stay. Mette, you
No, I
also...
just wanted to make you aware that Catherine had a comment.
Catherine.
Oh, sorry, it was extremely throwaway. Yeah, I mean, I think the question about persuasion, going back a little bit to Olli's thought, this may not be quite what he had in mind, but I think persuasiveness is very close to convincingness, and but teasing apart the differences there. And yes, of course, that comes to that kind of the fakery and the bullshit and all of that sort of question, but charismaticness in itself can, this is very culturally specific, but can itself feed into a sense of falseness or unconvincingness, because you think this person is too smooth, too charming, too likely to be spinning me a yarn kind of thing. I think it's, I mean, thinking about in a dramatic setting, something like, I don't know, have you ever listened to an audiobook where there's one reader, but they're doing a lot of different voices? And personally, for me, I almost always bounce very hard off those unless the vocal performances are exceptionally good, because there's almost always at least one or two of the voices they're doing that they don't do as well as they think they do. And I'm perhaps a little bit more, well, I don't know, perhaps a bit more easily irritated by that than some people might be. It's very, that sort of mutability and changeability, even if the setting in which the voice is happening is, you know, if you're primed for that to be happening, for the changes to be part of it, I think that's something that can itself lead to this undermining any sense of convincingness. So if you're trying to be persuasive, then it can be undermined by that sort of multi-trackness, which brings in that idea of no longer being convincing. But please ignore my silly remark about D&D. That wasn't intended to derail anything.
Oh, now I can see it. I didn't know what the remark was, and now we can see. But I'm watching the time, so I'll ask the very last question. And should anybody want to add anything to it when it looks like we have answered it, I'll give you the space and I'll ask you again if you'd like to add anything. But the last question, and I think that's actually a nice one to end on, is one of Olli's. Should vocal literacy become part of general education alongside reading and writing?
Can you repeat it?
Oh, should vocal literacy become part of general education alongside reading, writing? I know, our very energetic brains. This is the question we want to end on.
What does vocal literacy look like? I mean, if it could be like, to speak back to England, like comportment and diction training from a very young age, which has obviously been taught at elite schools or public schools. So, I mean,
So
versions of that have been already taught, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But it depends on how you define literacy.
Yeah.
If it's literacy in terms of where the field is at.
Because I thought when I read that question that what it was driving at was, should we discuss the theft of a vocal identity and things like this already within education, especially now with so much AI, so that people are more aware already from the young age. And I think now all teenagers have grown up with smartphones. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's correct. So that seems like the generation who should be especially aware of, be careful how you use your voice on these devices. So I thought that's what Olli was asking. Of course, we can't ask him.
I would like it to be like language ideological consciousness. And I think this is what I've been working in South Africa for about 10 years. And it's what I see in young people time and time again, is just like a really clear consciousness on what their linguistic resources mean to other people and around them, how they draw from, how they want to draw from them in their educational setting, how they're not able to, what the everyday kind of strategies they use to draw from them anyway, including in theatre and performance. And I think that's doing very similar activities with people there versus people in the UK. I was really able to see that over and over again, and it's come out of apartheid, unfortunately. This is kind of, you're right, like we shouldn't all have to go through an apartheid in order to have such language ideological consciousness raising, but yeah, I think this sense of kind of who we are and what we have fought for, that comes through a family and kind of place-based consciousness is, yeah, really paramount there. And I think I'd like to see it in more young people. So there could be a literacy around that. But that's also very political and not everyone's cup of tea.
I'm not going to ask any specific people, so if anybody would like to speak, please just say so.
There is a clause, if memory serves, in the teacher's guidelines for England, which Alex Baratta has talked about, and others, but Alex's work springs to mind here, which refers to the concept of articulacy. That's never defined, but I think we can probably take that as a proxy for standardness. It rolls together ideas like self-confidence, persuasiveness, maybe charisma as well. But there is I suppose, an idea out there that this is something that is desirable in children, that they can use English, which is the language that the people who draft the teachers' guidelines care about. The only one that they really care about, it seems to me. And an idea that besides being, good in reading and writing, also oral presentation is valued highly. The trouble is that, as I say, it seems to me that it has to be done on a particular set of terms. It's not like you can deviate too much from the script that we're all very familiar with. This is what it means to be an articulate speaker. This is what it means to be a persuasive speaker. And it's very, very tied up with accent, certainly in England. Yeah, clear speech. I don't know how things are in Denmark, but I imagine there's a similar kind of percept going on, that clear speech is tied up with not just with standardness, but also the writing system and all sorts of things that really just don't have anything to do with it. This idea that we speak using letters rather than sounds, and that somehow that the standard accent RP, or in its new guise, standard Southern British English, is somehow more closely tied to the spelling system. And, ideas like this, which are linguistically really poorly motivated, but which are treated almost as common sense. They're given this kind of stamp of institutional approval that few people other than linguists ever argue with. So I think there's something to explore there. As sociolinguists, I think we have a duty. I've said this in several places in writing. I think if we shrug and just say, well, that's just how it is, what can we do? Nobody ever listens to us. Well, that's just admitting defeat. And I think it's really important that as sociolinguists, because nobody else is going to do it, let's face it, as sociolinguists, we actually do try and rock the boat a bit and talk to stakeholders, like we did in the Accent Bias in Britain project, myself and Eris Levon and Christian Ilbury and Divyani Sharma and others, try to at least make a small step in the direction of sharing with the wider world what we as sociolinguists think about language and speech, because
also,
we risk just ending up talking to one another and the rest of the world just goes on as it always has and nobody cares. So I think there's a really important there's a duty incumbent on us, I think, that we do have to try to redress the balance a bit, even if it ends up being a futile exercise. We have to try, I think.
But I'm also deeply convinced, I realize that the effect of this is probably not as huge as it would be nice for it to be. But many of us have tens of students every year, and so maybe it's just wishful thinking, but my heart just hopes that, okay, we discuss these things in classes, and they will go off to all kinds of areas of life, and hopefully with some students this will stay, and hopefully they will spread it. So I also think, I completely agree with what you've been saying. I also think that the education area is, I'm wondering if that's actually the most potent one. Yeah.
Yes. I also wanted to add to what you are saying, especially regarding presentations. I think it's not just teaching students how to present, but also, and probably more nowadays, that there's a lot of technology, and maybe, and we can see it also, no? That we have a break and maybe we go to our phones, but we haven't grown up like this. So how can we also make people so aware of how powerful it is to know what is our voice, and maybe we can still not define it properly, but how is it that when I'm talking to someone and I'm looking at someone, because we're having a conversation, what is it that I can really produce to the other, and what is the impact that my words, but also how I'm saying all what I'm saying, has on the others, because we're using voice every single day, but we are not trained in really what are the parameters, how can they be used, what are the combinations. So I think that this is really something that maybe also Olli wanted to entail here, that this is something that is, in my opinion, is really crucial, that we can add to education much more than now.
And I'll suggest that we actually end on this note. Before I close off completely, would anybody in this room like to add anything to sort of as a final comment? People want to go home. In that case, I'm just going to list those who said things during this roundtable, and then we'll thank our speakers. So online, from left to right, we have Catherine Sangster, we have Don Watt, and in this physical room we have Claire French, we have Mette Hjortshøj Sørensen, who also spoke, Nate Young, who also spoke, and Io Valsrates, who also spoke. Could we thank our speakers for these 2 hours?
Of course. Thank you.